I think Ronald Reagan said this about us, you can do a lot if you don't want the credit. And to me, it's never about trying to get the credit, and it's not about me and my positioning or where I am or what my title is. It's about how we really stay true to pushing for those goals that we care about.
Before we dive in, a quick whisper about today's sponsor, Ghost Founder. You know that moment when an idea jumps from someday to why not today? Ghost Founder lives in that moment. Ghost Founder takes the sketch from your napkin, gives it a heartbeat, and walks it out into the world. Fast. While everyone else is still writing pitch decks, the ghosts are wiring prototypes, lining up seed investors, and tuning your ops. Product market fit isn't just a hope, it's an outcome. If you're the kind of renegade who refuses to wait for permission, visit ghostfounder.com. Because around here, we scope things, build things, and fund things, in that order. Ghost Founder, the quiet engine behind loud breakthroughs. Welcome to the next episode of The Covered Call, today with esteemed Deborah Lehr. Most people know the headlines about the US-China situation, but very few people have actually been in the room shaping that story. Deborah has. She was there when China joined the WTO. She's advised Wall Street and Washington, and today she's at the front lines of green finance and building bridges to the Middle East. When nations weaponize the monetary system, resources, and trade, we call it strategy. But underneath it all, it's about freedom. Who gets to decide what moves? Who gets to build? And who gets to choose their own path? Deborah has spent her career navigating these systems, from Beijing to Washington to the Gulf, building bridges where most people see only barriers. In this conversation, we hope to explore what it means to stay independent inside of global power structures, as massive as these, and where global capital is heading next. And how do you position yourself for success and in this increasingly volatile world? Deborah Lehr, thank you so much for taking the time to come and speak with us today.
Well, I'm delighted to be here, and thanks for that very generous introduction.
So, Deborah, a few episodes ago, we had your friend Jen Sue Scott on, and she was really a lot of fun, and we got so much good feedback for that episode. And she was the one that introduced us to you. So, I'm sure many of my friends in the audience would be asking, like, how is it that you guys came to know each other? Would that be something that would be okay for us to ask and try and tease out?
Of course, I'm such a huge fan of Jen's, and she truly is one of these unique and remarkable women who can transcend many different worlds, not just geographically, but sectorally, having been successful in health, in AI, in the entertainment world as advisors to television shows. So she's such a unique individual. And we first actually met each other at a conference and in Saudi Arabia, and we became fast friends. And we have been in close touch, seeing each other in many geographic worlds, um, even if our professional lives don't necessarily overlap, they certainly touch each other. And with her focus on tech and China, it's an area that has been of great interest for many years for the Paulson Institute, which I'm the executive director of, but even in the work that we do with a number of our clients. And so I was very privileged to have her join our advisory board when we were at Edelman and to continue to have opportunities to work with her.
Right. Okay. That's one of the mysteries solved. But yeah, thanks for sharing.
Yeah.
So cool that that can happen, right, at that level when you're traveling around doing things all over the world.
Mhm. It is, and we
Deborah,
tend to
first,
see each other in places Singapore, Saudi, Hong Kong, Chengdu for her birthday.
wow,
So it's a global relationship.
nice.
Yeah, Jason and I have one of those as well, but uh, we haven't met in Asia nearly enough times.
Uh-huh.
Um, Deborah, I wanted to get a little bit of your personal journey for the beginning. So you were the youngest director of Asian Affairs at the National Security Council, which is a body that essentially sits next to the President of the United States and helps coordinate foreign policy. And please correct me if anything I say is inaccurate, right? What drove you to reach that position, and what was it like to sit in that chair?
Well, first, it was a great privilege. George H.W. Bush was the president, and General Scowcroft, who one of my all-time heroes, was the national security advisor, and they were longtime friends. And it was at a time I had gone to China to study when I was a student and had hoped to be involved in that world. I started my career working at the Commerce Department, which was a whole wonderful and great experience on its own. And it happened at that time that the one issue that we had going on in a major way was really trade with China. It was at the end of um, H.W. Bush's first term, President Bush's first term. And it was a time when Tiananmen had happened. We were starting to rebuild the relationship, but trade was the big area of focus. And we had a big trade negotiation going on at that time, one of the biggest still that bilateral agreements that had ever been done with any country. And it really was an opportunity to get China to start to open the market for many of our leading exports. But really, a lot of it was building blocks to put in place some of the trade structures. In those days, China didn't even publish its trade rules, its laws and regulations. And if you were a foreign company and you had a copy of them, you actually could be arrested because they were confidential and viewed as top secret. So you were expected to comply with them, but you couldn't see them. So these were just some of the building blocks that we felt we had to put in place. Another basic one, which sounds, very naive in today's world, but they didn't have a consistent tariff code. And so you could negotiate tariff rates at the border. And one of the things that we really pushed for was there was a published set of tariff codes and for consistency at the borders, because of course it was the provinces that were benefiting, not the central government in that sense from the revenues. And so they, of course, saw the merit in making sure that there was some consistency. So I was very privileged when they had an opening to have the opportunity to go to the National Security Council. And while we were working on quite a few other important issues in reestablishing the relationship after Tiananmen, we did have a big focus on concluding that major trade agreement.
And Deborah, then would you say your work currently at Basilina, am I pronouncing that correct?
Yes, you are.
Okay.
Basilina.
Basilina, okay. Would you say that that's something of a continuation of what you were doing back then at the start?
Well, it's a little bit. Certainly from what I left the national security and went over to the U.S. Trade Representative because we were just starting to have a trade relationship with China. And again, if you think this was back in the 1990s, I doubled the size of the China office. So the China office was only one person in those years because trade wasn't such a big issue. And then we were two. And we did 3 major trade agreements on intellectual property rights, and we're starting to do some of the building block pieces that would lead up to China's WTO accession negotiations. And a lot of our time, though, was spent solving companies' problems. And that continues to be one of the issues. We're not as focused as much anymore on market access. That used to be a big part of what we were doing, taking companies into China for the first time, helping them get established. Today, a lot of the work tends to be problem solving still of issues, whether it's companies who are under investigation or companies who just are having some challenges in how they negotiate through the Chinese antitrust system or approval processes, but also helping them expand and build relationships in the provinces, which are so incredibly important and powerful.
So, I don't have conscious memory. I mean, I'm not that young, but at the time I just didn't care, right? What China was doing, China joining the WTO. I was certainly conscious. I, however, was not paying attention. But it's amazing what can unfold in 25 years, right? So if we fast forward a bit to what's happening right now, I mean, the U.S.-China relationship is dominating pretty much all the headlines, right? And and it's not just confined to U.S. China. It's really China in the EU and China in Africa, China in the Middle East. There's headlines all around. So if you look back in the rearview mirror a bit,
This is how it started, and how would you say it's going?
Well, that's a great question. I think that there, if I would go back, I still think that it was a good thing for China to join the WTO. What I think a lot of people forget is that the WTO was a very new institution and that there were grand ambitions for what the WTO would become. The idea was to create this global trading body that would continue to evolve over time and continue to be the arbiter of the global trading rules. But the challenge was it didn't evolve. And the global rounds that they'd hoped to accomplish to keep up with today's trading world never happened. And so the WTO, in many ways, it still serves an important function, but it's a little bit antiquated and not reflective of what today's global trading system looks like. And when the WTO was negotiated with China, their agreement, it was essentially an 8-year max agreement, setting guidelines for what would happen over that time period. And so in cases where the requirements were very clear, China implemented those. In the cases where it was vague and it was left up to the WTO for interpretation, or sectors that were new, there are no guidelines. And that, I think, has been a challenge. And I do think one of the good things that the Trump administration did in the first term was to start bilateral trade negotiations with China. There have been long thought, because China was in the WTO, we shouldn't do it bilaterally, we should do it multilaterally. But we have much more leverage to get this accomplished if we do it directly. And I think that was a very good thing. And it did lead to the first trade agreement that we'd had with China since its accession to the WTO. And it was long overdue.
Um, Deborah, from my position as a absolute outsider, right, only reading the news articles, the headlines, the tweets, and I mean, also checking with my friends in China to see what the view is from the other side of the fence, right? It seems like every other day there's a big, banging on the table saying that, everything's bad, we need to start again, or, we're going to rewrite the rules. It's almost sounds very chaotic. Is that something that's just, you think, to sensationalize what's actually happening, or do you think behind the curtains there's actually constructive bricks being put in place so that it's going to be really great for everyone if the US and China can find a way to work together in a win-win situation, right?
Both countries have benefited from China's growth, and both countries have had challenges. Some of the challenges that China is facing with its own economic situation today are of its own doing, of decisions that were made over the course of the last 20 years. Then some of the good things that they did to help the globe in 2008 during the financial crisis, to help the global economy, have come back to bite them in other ways, particularly around the environmental challenges that China had faced and kind of runaway growth and debt that they're still dealing with. And so when it comes to finding a new path forward, we definitely needed to have a new framework for US-China relations, because we couldn't use the old playbook, because both countries have changed, and both priorities of what governments wanted to have for their own people had changed. And we see very different demands today in the US and very different demands in China. I think probably on Xi Jinping's to-do list, US-China relations are probably not in the top 5, except when there's a lot of noise going on and it looks like it's harmful to him achieving his own domestic priorities. But he has a lot that he has to accomplish at home still. So when you hear a lot of this noise, sure, trade is chaotic. China, for all that you say about it being a controlled economy, which in many ways it is, it's still highly capitalistic at some points. Highly, highly competitive in ways that we don't face here in the United States. And so finding what that ground is, but also in any negotiation, there's a public element and a private element. And to me, the key is both sides have to be talking. And to know that Secretary Bessent is still engaged with his counterparts and that there are discussions going on at the working levels, that's the important thing. all the noise that you hear publicly is noise. Some of it obviously is translated into real action. I mean, the president could impose tariffs in November again. But a lot of this is positioning or frustration that's coming out or playing to domestic audiences. The key is to make sure that those talks are still continuing. If the talks stop, then I would be worried.
Okay, so from your perspective, they're still talking, so things are still moving along, so we
Yes.
have reason to be hopeful.
Hopefully. I mean, there is hopefully there will be a meeting of the two presidents in Korea on the margins of the APEC. And hopefully there will be a state visit by President Trump to China early next year. And that creates some positive momentum that at least you're working towards outcomes.
Thank you for that insight.
We'll see. I mean, it's a rocky road. Right?
For sure. So I've heard people say this, and I wanted to get your take on it. You know, in recent years, people have said, "Oh, you know, when China joined the WTO, the West hoped that China would become more like the West, right? More capitalistic, more liberal in a sense, and maybe it would catch the spark of democracy or something." But then, what I've heard people say recently is, well, it actually kind of looks like the West has caught some of the less pleasant aspects of China, right? There's a lot more control of the media now, you know, since the COVID era, as there's been, as you know, as far as I can remember. For example, really, so unfortunately, the West feels a little bit more like a centralized regime in a sense. What do you think about that?
Well, I think while there may have been people back in those years who had hopes that China would become a democracy by joining the WTO, certainly on behalf of the negotiators and those of us involved, that was never the goal, the intent, or a realistic assumption, because that, of course, would have meant regime change. Uh, what we had hoped, and maybe this was just our perspective from the trade side, is that we would create a more consistent, professional, law-based trading system that allowed our companies to do business there on a much fairer playing field. And I think if you look back where China was and where China has come today, not to say that there aren't still incidents about IP theft and uh, various other challenges they face in favoritism for local firms and things like that. But I do think it's a much fairer playing field in many ways for US companies than it used to be. So I think that was accomplished. Did we believe that China was going to become a democracy? Absolutely not. As I said, there were some people who may have talked about that kind of thing, but certainly from where we sat at USTR, that was never one of the goals. It was to create this legal structure. Would you say that the West has adopted it? I think that's moved in that direction. Hard to say when you can get any piece of news today and anybody can write anything that they want to on so many different kinds of social media platforms. And how do you have a censorship of the media when I can put out anything I want on Facebook or on Twitter or X, on any of these platforms? And so it's much more accessible. And in many ways, in some ways, media has become more democratized, I would say, because so many people can access these platforms and write what they want.
Yeah, I think that's a completely fair assessment. The only wrench I would throw into that is that there is an increasing number of you know, arrests basically for what people post on social media. And of course, you can see these numbers, but you don't know, of course, what they said, right? So I'm not saying that it's impossible to post something online that warrants being arrested. I think that is absolutely possible. It's just a bit concerning when there's a sudden increase in that trend, if that makes sense. But then, of
No,
course,
and
yeah.
that I understand. And do I think that there's some self-censorship going on by some media organizations? Certainly.
Mm.
Certainly people don't want to become, I think there's a lot of caution about being a target of the administration. I will leave it to others to debate which direction things had gone
Mhm.
in one way or another. Are we reflecting a swing back to the center? Are we reflecting a more conservative, government audience? Things like this. There have been, even this week, all kinds of stories going back and forth about youth becoming more conservative in their expectations. And so lots of different dynamics going on.
W- from your perspective, so Jason and I talk about this a lot, and we feel like this is a trend that we observe. But would you say there is a geopolitical power shift happening at the moment?
Certainly, I think in the companies that we talk to, geopolitics is probably one of their top concerns because it's so unpredictable. And certainly with an America First approach, it's a change in the vision of how the United States displays its power and the role that it wants to play in the world. I think President Trump has been much more comfortable showing US power than, say, the previous administration. And what happened in the Middle East just recently is a very good example of that. And what he's been attempting to do through the use of tariffs, through the use of his platforms to try and bring an end to the war in Ukraine and Russia, show his willingness to use US power to take action geopolitically. On the other hand, this administration has a different view of the role that the United States should play as a superpower. And so they're not as willing to engage through international institutions, more focused on wanting to use US power unilaterally or bilaterally, not as active as the Biden administration, I would say, in trying to build coalitions of interested parties. But if you looked at what happened just at Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, you'll see a coalition of Europeans and other Middle Eastern countries who came and participated. So those coalitions are there, but that has not been the priority in taking the action and pulling out of institutions like UNESCO and questioning the role that the United States will continue to play, and organizations like the United Nations, I think really does show a shift. At the same time, China's economic power has changed significantly over the last 20 years. And today, China is probably the largest trading partner to about 70% of the world. And still, even though its economy has been going through challenges, still makes up, what is it, around 17% of global growth. So through its economic might, it definitely has a power, and it's changed the relationships that China has and impacts the relationship that the United States has in a lot of other countries, particularly, as you were mentioning earlier, Latin America, where we see significant increase in Chinese companies investing and trading, and the Middle East. And that changes, I think, the dynamic. It's still those countries want to have a good relationship with the United States, but they're much more reluctant to have a bad relationship with China.
Hmm.
One of the Chinese ambassadors, one of the previous ones, said to us, this was maybe a decade ago at this point, but it was a very interesting observation and very logical. As Chinese investment continued overseas and as China was pushing really hard for their companies to go out, you would see much more of an activist foreign policy from China. And I think that's been one of the big shifts as well. Whereas China didn't tend to be on the playing field, or they were looking at their relationships with countries as simply an economic one, they've been much more willing in recent years to get involved in some of the foreign policy issues. And the actions that they took related to Iran with Saudi Arabia and Iran had a big impact in Saudi Arabia and how they were viewing China, and China as a helpful partner in their own foreign policy agenda.
No, that's very interesting. I don't know if how firm you are on that. I assume you know everything there is to know about it, but could you expand on that a little bit? Because my vibe is that this relationship between the U.S. and China right now is somewhat adversarial. But my my very limited experience of visiting China exactly twice, right, is that the nature of the Chinese person that I met there, and we met some very interesting, very successful people, is that they're much more interested in they're very entrepreneurial, they're very capitalistic, and they want to collaborate and they want to be successful, and they want to make an impact on the world in their own way. The average Chinese person, from how I met them, is not interested in a trade war, but I think the average American isn't either, right? But so
And if you talk same thing, if you talk to American entrepreneurs, they want to
yeah,
go
they
build their business,
build a
do well,
business
and
exactly. But so I find that I think there's a lot more people outside of the US and China. I think there's a lot more people who would actually they're just looking for a good business partner, right? And if China is that to them, so be it, right? Why not? What's your insight into that?
well, I do think, for a long time, a lot of entrepreneurs saw that they could innovate in the West, innovate in the US or in Europe, and then commercialize in China. And it still is the place to go if you really want to go big. China is still a very important market, and it remains a very important market for a lot of American companies. They just are changing their attitude because of the geopolitics. They may be changing the way that they're doing business there. And so you see many separating out China from the rest of the world. So they look at China for China and potentially looking at China as a domestic market in itself, as opposed to in the past, a lot of Western companies tended to manufacture there and then export to the rest of the world. And so as China has become more sophisticated, we've seen, and it's, even though it has a long way to go on consumption, there is still a big domestic market, and it's of interest to many, many companies. And then they have the rest of the world, and they're separated because of the geopolitics, but also for other reasons. One, because of the state of the Chinese economy. One of the reasons that direct foreign investment has fallen so much is, of course, in part because of the geopolitics, but a large part because of what's happening with the Chinese domestic economy. And now that we're starting to see a pickup again in the tech world, and you all know this, I'm sure, much better than I do, but we're starting to see a number of those investors then sniffing around deals in China again, and some of that capital starting to go back.
I mean, one thing that Jason, I've observed and talked about is that the Chinese seem to innovate out of necessity in a way. And so, for example, with this AI, I don't want to call it an arms race, because I think that's framing the whole AI technology already in the bad light. I don't want to think of it as a weapon, because that's just scary. But when you take the best NVIDIA chips off the market in China, China turns around and innovates a different method to make chips that are not quite as good, but pretty freaking close. And it seems almost like the more pressure you put on the Chinese to innovate, they will channel this stress somehow. And then a couple weeks later, you see a headline, you're like, oh, they solved the problem. And you're just like, how is this even possible? They just keep doing this. So what this could mean, though, to an investor is, oh, they can do more with less, right? So if you they don't have this giga VC capital pipeline as the US does, and somehow they can still pull it off. Maybe not as good, but close enough. Is it?
I think there's several different elements in what you were saying there. One,
Mm-hmm.
China is innovators. And certainly China's come a long way. And they had to build a lot of that ecosystem that you were talking about. With first, you need to create the right kind of schooling that encourages innovative thinking
Mm-hmm.
and those educational opportunities. You need to have access to capital. You need to have a good legal system and protect your intellectual property. Otherwise,
Mm-hmm.
everybody will steal it. And we always thought, when we were doing our negotiations, that as soon as China had its own innovative society, it would start better protecting intellectual property rights. And that's what we've seen. And we've seen that come a really long way in the last 20 years. But also, in part, I think it's driven out of necessity. But when you have 1.5 billion people who are, many of them, highly motivated, highly educated in Western universities, in that kind of ecosystem, you are going to have a lot of entrepreneurs. And when it's clear, when the government says, we're thinking about X, you have a lot of people running to do X because they think it's a government priority, and there might be funding there, and there's certainly going to be policy support for what you're doing. And that's where we've seen that huge growth in EVs. It's where we've seen the development batteries, solar panels. Part was necessity, but part is leapfrogging old technologies to come up with new ideas and often just improving on existing technologies, which is also where I think China's done a good job.
Hey, Deborah, when preparing for the interview, I read your article, When Mistakes Need a Manual. Uh, yeah, I really enjoyed it. Super well done. China's guidance on acceptable decision making. Like, I found it quite amusing to read, but also really, really on point, right? Because it touched upon the indirect nature, oftentimes, of direct orders in China. So, you talked just now about the private sector being able to leapfrog, and they've come a long way. Uh, Intellectual property now is getting more recognized, etc. Right? But I wanted to ask from the viewpoint of the governing structure, right? As China climbs that ladder of global influence, you think it's going to be as I think they're always going to be efficient, but do you think they're going to be as effective now that they're coming at things from a different vantage point? Because in a way, driving that vehicle that is a super developing country that's very poor, and you want to get them from point A to point B, is very different from then driving that same vehicle from point B to point C, where you're almost like racing a different race now, right?
Mhm.
Do you think they're well positioned?
Yeah, I think I did write that article because I'm struck by a number of these edicts that have been coming out of the government around trying to guide behavior. It was just like the three the three Pats, and I don't know if you saw the piece that I wrote on that as well, but again, that I think the intent was trying to somehow through policy means get local officials to act responsibly and create some guidelines. And I think it's very interesting that at this far into President Xi's leadership, that they still have such active anti-corruption campaigns, and they still have policy enforcement teams that go out into the provinces and the municipalities to ensure that policy is being implemented on a consistent basis, that it makes you wonder about the governing structures to ensure consistency of policy. And it's not saying that people can't reach into the system and take care of one issue. Certainly, there's no problem. They can do that. They can shut down a factory, or they can punish a city if they're not following the right directive. But to ensure that it's done on a consistent basis without having to have those negative elements is something that seems to still be a challenge. And so, how does that translate overseas? And I think that was your question. Is that right? And how does that translate? It's not clear. I think foreign policy is a little bit easier to control because it does tend to be at the center. And so that is something that you don't depend so much on all of the country, just like we do here, that the administration is in charge of foreign policy. And so they can control that easier in determining what the policy is and then what people are saying overseas, and how you govern that through our embassies and other things and through visits and negotiations. And so China has a little bit more control, but at home, that's those governance structures are what I find very interesting, that they still are coming out with these kinds of statements and challenges.
I mean, it's from outsider's perspective, eh, I think it's quite refreshing because it makes it part of the public record, so to speak, that they acknowledge there is an issue that needs to be fixed. And when I think about governance in the EU, I'm talking to you from Germany right now. I'm a German citizen, even though I'm uh, at least part-time in the US. Anti-corruption campaign sounds great. I think we could have some of those, and they might be very beneficial to the EU citizens at large. I'm sure our vests are not clean by any stretch of the imagination.
So, what do you say to that?
Well, I do think the West has, we maybe look at it differently, that we have clear legal structures and that corrupt officials tend to get caught within that. And we do have investigations. And I don't know, I haven't seen, at least in the dealings that I have had, certainly in the US government, but with others, that we have been faced with corruption related issues. Actually, I never faced it in China either, but I wasn't dealing at the level that a number of companies were, and we did hear about it. It's just American companies couldn't engage. And I remember one Hong Kong Taipan telling me many years ago, never get started, because if you pay one off, there'll always be another one that comes along.
Yeah, you just want to be known as the person that never engages in such activities, right? So that
That's right.
people will know beforehand how to wiggle and position that negotiation.
And certainly for the US, we have very strict laws on what you can do, not just here at home, but overseas as well. So the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is very strict.
No, yeah. Go ahead, Jay. No, how do you see China currently? Let's say if they're transitioning from a developing nation to hopefully becoming from their perspective, hopefully becoming a developed nation. Do you see any pitfalls for them that, from your perspective, they should try very hard to navigate around and not fall into? Any obvious things that come on your radar?
Well, it's hard to argue that China isn't a developed nation when they've got such a sophisticated trading system as they do. Granted, still, that there are a large number of people who are at poverty levels, and China has done an unbelievably remarkable job at bringing so many people out of abject poverty, and deserves huge credit for that, and providing opportunity for them. But as a developed country, again, I think in looking at their position in the world, this is one of the big questions of what is the path that China will take. And will they step up to be, and this is something that Bob Zella came up with many years ago, who was our former Deputy Secretary of State and U.S. Trade Representative, but a responsible citizen, essentially, and taking on some of the obligations that are expected of great powers in their relations in the world, upholding the trading system, upholding some of the humanitarian aid, providing leadership on issues. And it's a debate we clearly are having in the United States now, going back to one of the questions that you asked earlier about how the administration looks at its role as a great power. And this is one of the debates that is going on in China. And we start to see little bits of it coming out. President Xi has talked about upholding the WTO, upholding the global trading system, that China wants to continue to do this, but we still have a number of issues for American companies that are unfair, or Western companies, or foreign companies that are unfair in China. Markets that are closed, trading practices that are political, things like that, that we'd like to see a little bit more movement in the direction of opening and consistency and adherence to the global trading rules. On other areas, China has said, and President Xi gave a big speech about this at the UN, that it would step up when it came to climate and biodiversity. And China has been experimenting with a lot of different kinds of models of what it can be doing. And it has the benefit, because of the system that it has, of being able to kind of dictate from the top down and set policy from the top down, to create an infrastructure that could allow some really interesting experiments to be done about how you, for example, create assets, financial assets, out of birds and bees and trees, and experimenting around that. So it could open up a whole new area of economic growth for China and set a model for other countries.
We had a previous guest on, right, Lovis? David Fishman, I think 2 episodes ago, and he works in he's an American, if I'm not wrong, and he works in the energy sector in China. And he passed a comment that I found to be true in my own experience, but it was still very interesting nonetheless. He said, uh, in China, climate's not more important than environment, right? Like that the bees, the birds, the fish, the water, that everything is clean. That's just as important as the level of CO2 in our atmosphere, right? Compared relatively to the West, I don't know, in the last 20 years, I guess, anything that's an environmental movement in the West now seems to always be about climate and only about climate. Of course, I'm generalizing a lot, right? But relatively speaking, would you say that that's true in your experience too?
Uh, well, the latter part definitely I think is true. And the Paulson Institute has just come out with a report looking at the biodiversity financing gap and that the gap is growing. And even though there have been some interesting things that have been done around nature finance, that the political will isn't really there to address it. And one of the challenges has been that there's been this huge rush to address issues on climate. So we see building up these massive solar farms and the wind farms and so on, but the planning hasn't gone into them in some cases to ensure that it's consistent and not destroying the biodiversity. So some of the wind farms have been put up in the paths of migratory birds who can't get through. So they go back and they're either being killed by the blades or they have to go back and skip a mating season. We've seen some incidents of that recently. Or the solar farms are built in beautiful prairies versus so you cut down the grasslands versus putting them in a place maybe in a parking lot or other practical things like that. And so finding ways to make sure that climate isn't killing biodiversity, and this is something Mr. Paulson has written a lot about. We had a piece in the FT that was very similar to that theme, but to make sure that they're considered together and that the solutions are complementary.
Yeah, that's super good
Deb,
to hear. Sorry to
yeah,
interrupt, but yeah.
no,
Uh,
Hank likes to call it, to make sure that biodiversity isn't the stepchild. And so when you look at even just the two conferences that take place, there's a CBD COP for biodiversity, and you maybe get one head of state. But look at what happens with the COP, which is focused on climate. You get lots of heads of state who attend, and biodiversity gets a theme day in that. It should be a core part of what's being discussed at the climate COP. They should be integrated.
yeah, I agree.
Deborah, I wanted to shift a little bit. So, because I know in recent times you have shifted, at least that's how it presents online, you have shifted your focus to the Middle East somewhat. What opportunities do you see there that most may be overlooking?
Well, I never thought I would be working in the Middle East. And it's actually been really a wonderful joy and absolutely fascinating. And it was started because I'd actually been working at Merrill Lynch during the financial crisis. And I was working for John Thane, and we were working on a really big China deal. And when he was let go by Bank of America during the transition, those few of us who'd come with him were also let go. And I had an opportunity to do something else. I started taking an archaeology class, and the Egyptian revolution took place, and we were hearing about mass reports of archaeological looting going on in Egypt. And I knew the minister of Antiquities. And anyway, we started an effort to work with the Egyptian embassy here and with the Egyptians. And it kind of went from there. We started working across the Middle East and building relationships and ties, often with the ambassadors here, who many times went back to their own countries to be the foreign minister, even the heads of state. And they knew that I was working on China. And so some of them started talking to us about, could we help them? Could we advise them? Could we talk to this company or that company? And it kind of grew organically to see the opportunities. And when I look at what's happening in Saudi Arabia, for example, and I can't say that I'm a Saudi expert or that I've been traveling there a long time, but I did have my first trip around 2015. And even in that period of time, to see the change that's taken place is amazing. But what's so exciting is to feel the entrepreneurial spirit when you're there. They have a very young population, and many have been educated outside of the kingdom, and to see them coming back, and particularly the fast growth of women in the workplace, has created the opening of all kinds of new sectors and new opportunities. And while for foreign firms going in, it's still relatively new in the market, unlike the UAE, which has been often the first landing place for many foreign firms going into the Middle East. We see growth in the financial sector, in the retail sector, in the beauty sector, in hospitality, certainly in tech. And the kingdom has set itself up to be the e-games capital of the world and one of the gaming leaders in gaming. And you saw recently they made the purchase of the big American gaming company. But it's a huge opportunity there, sports and culture. And they've had a very concerted effort to really build out and develop their cultural sector. And it's interesting because for the longest time, no one looked at pre-Islamic culture, pre-Islamic archaeology or anything. So there's a lot of history to talk about from the whole region. For example, the Nabateans who built Petra, when they were kicked out of Petra and now Jordan by the Romans, they settled in what's now Saudi Arabia. And so there's this beautiful place, Al Ula, that is like a mini Petra that's being developed as a tourism site, but it combines archaeology, modern art, high-end hotels, and music. A number of the concerts that have taken place, Lionel Richie, Bocelli, many of these others are happening in Al Ula. So I think lots of interesting opportunity, and the world really is starting to now focus and turn its attention to the growth. And I suspect if this peace can last in the region, we'll see a lot more tourism. Actually, both, I think the Gulf countries, especially the UAE and Saudi, have seen nature and climate as diplomatic platforms for them to rise within those international institutions and take leadership roles. A woman in the UAE heads up the IUCN. Until recently, an Egyptian woman was heading up UNODC, I think. So lots of interesting opportunities around all these different sectors. It's really quite exciting. It feels a lot like China 20 years ago when China was going through this big boom, an entrepreneurial kind of push. You can feel a lot of that in the kingdom.
So, Deborah, you touched on the topic a couple of times just now. You are part of a founder of the Antiquities Coalition, right?
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit more about it? Because I found the stated mission really intriguing, really novel, and I was hoping you could tell us a little bit more about how the Antiquities Coalition, um, what it's doing. How does it help the modern slash common man, and why is this a cause worth fighting for?
Well, thank you, because it's an issue very, very near and dear to my heart. And as I mentioned earlier, we founded it coming out of the Egyptian revolution when we felt that Egypt needed help in a time of crisis. And clearly, saving lives during the revolution and other things was really important. But a large part of the Egyptian economy is based around cultural tourism. And anybody who was looting and destroying archaeological sites was actually harming Egypt's economic future and, of course, its cultural history. So we took an approach of looking at what were the legal and policy tools that we could bring to bear to help, as well as providing, as opposed to, there are lots of wonderful organizations. I'm involved in the World Monument Fund, for example, that will go in and do restoration work. But we wanted to help with the legal structure. What can the governments do? How can the international community help? So that's what we have focused on. And starting with Egypt, there are actually these agreements that can be signed with the United States. And we work very closely on a cultural property agreement with Egypt to help them with the United States that creates the platform for ensuring Egyptian looted antiquities can't be sold in the United States. And that's important because we're the largest art market in the world. And it changes the burden of proof, which is significant. So If you don't have an agreement, Egypt had to show that the item was looted. If you do have an agreement, I, as an importer, have to show it's a legitimate product.
Right.
And so we started those kinds of structures. So we've worked with countries around the Middle East to help them negotiate these agreements with the United States. And that's really shifted a lot of the debate. But we also realized that we needed to bring all the players together. So we convened countries in the Middle East to show this is a regional issue and they needed to be working together. We brought in some of the art market, so the auction houses, to try and push for greater responsibility on their part in ensuring that they're aware of what they're selling, because the art market is still the largest in the United States unregulated market. The buyer and sellers don't have to disclose who they are. And when you're dealing in sometimes multi-million-dollar transactions, you can imagine it creates a lot of opportunity for some bad people to get involved. And we've seen that also happening with the art market being used to get around US sanctions. And so we look at all those different kinds of issues and trying to stop some of those loopholes.
And would other countries besides, or have you seen other countries besides those in the Middle East sign up for these frameworks that you've put in place?
Yes, some Latin American countries have them. We've now expanded and been working in Southeast Asia, Central Europe. Uzbekistan has one now, for example, and China has one. But China's was signed a long time ago, but China's got one. It was renewed recently. Italy. So there are quite a few of them. But also trying to get these countries to work together, because often we found that the proceeds being used for selling these looted antiquities are going to support organized crime like the cartels in Latin America, or at the height of ISIS. ISIS had a very actually sophisticated network that they did. They had a ministry of extraction, and part was for extracting oil and part was for extracting antiquities. And they had a permitting system, a taxation system, they had their own auction house, a very sophisticated structure to fundraise off selling looted antiquities.
So as a total layperson, right, I can understand if you were from those countries and you realize that there was a demand for them and you could potentially make a lot of money, that you would want to sell your country's antiquities, right? But what's driving the demand side? Do you know? Could you share with us, like, what makes people want to pay so much money for these things that are, I don't know, something that belongs to another country or another culture? What's driving that value?
Well, I do think historically people have always wanted to collect beautiful items. And these are beautiful statues, frescoes, uh, sarcophagus. There was a gold sarcophagus, for example, that was looted in Egypt soon after the 2011 revolution, smuggled to Paris, restored. Fake provenance was created, and the Metropolitan Museum in New York bought it. During fashion, the Met Gala, it happened to have a gold theme that year, and Kim Kardashian posed right next to it. And when people dug into the provenance of the item, if they'd Googled the provenance, they would have found it was off a year for the creation of the Arab Republic of Egypt. It was 1 year off. It said the year before it was actually created. And so when they started to unwind, it was determined it was part of a antiquities dealership in Europe that now the founders have been arrested. I think one was in Germany and one was in France, but it was also linked to the former head of the Louvre who was purchasing from them. He's under investigation, and his right-hand person has been indicted, and they were providing antiquities, amongst others, to the Louvre Abu Dhabi. So it's quite a network. So there is a big demand for collecting these items. And most people, and I want to be clear, most people want to buy something that's legitimate. They're not looking to be engaged in the illegal trade. But it's very hard for people to tell when you have one item. It's not like a gun or a drug, which just on sight, there's an issue. If
Mhm.
you're looking at an ancient statue, you don't know if it's legal or not legal. And so that's why people really have to do their homework when they're making these kinds of purchases. The other thing is it used to be in the old days when you would want to buy one of these antiquities, you tended to go to a store in Manhattan or in London or in Paris. You'd go see the item. They'd have others in a warehouse, all of this. In today's world, you can look on WhatsApp. You have secret communications. You can transfer money easily. You have expedited shipping that can get things through. You don't have to have big warehouses. It can all be done online. So the trade is much easier also than it used to be.
Yeah, makes complete
It's
sense. I
probably more
think
than you wanted to know, but
no,
Oh,
it's,
no. I think it illuminates the subject because you always see it as a fringe topic, right? It's not something that's front and center. But I can imagine when you go to a historical site, like I've visited some before, and they say, hey, this is the site. There's a gaping hole somewhere because this thing was looted during this period of time, and you can actually feel the pain of the local people when they are describing that, right? Like it's
exactly.
something that is still yet to come home, and they're still hoping that one day it will, right? So when that's why I said when I read what the Antiquities Coalition was about, I found it to be, yeah, very inspiring. So thank you for putting your energy and efforts into that.
um, Deborah, I wanted to get know more about green finance, which is now one of the banner topics, I think, of Basilina, and maybe it always has been. But and I want to set you up a little bit in a facetious way, right? So tell me a little bit about green finance, and is there really more to it than just kind of hollow ESG virtue signaling? Is there really a way for green finance to become an economic engine?
Uh, Excellent question. And we look at both at Baselina, but also at the Paulson Institute, two different things. One, green finance, but also nature finance. And China is one of the countries that really put green finance on the map at a high level when they were they took over the G20 presidency and started a green finance working group. And in those years, about a decade ago, green finance tended to be a philanthropic issue. Sat in the foundations of the banks. Big foundations were putting the seed money there. There wasn't a common definition of what's green, although that still is debatable. Uh, and there wasn't the sophisticated infrastructure for how you could deal in any kind of green finance related transaction. 10 years later, it's a field of itself. There is a whole taxonomy. You see the ratings agencies having built indices for rating green bonds. You've seen huge growth in climate bonds, huge opportunities investing in what climate, getting companies to start to look at what their climate risk is. And certainly this has become a political topic, and putting aside the politics of climate and debating, I'm not here to debate whether climate change exists or doesn't exist. But if you look at the risks associated with weather events and natural disasters and things like that, which we are seeing an increase in, companies have to look at what their risk is related to that. Insurance companies, housing companies, financial institutions, and so on. And so it has taken off and become something of its own. And I think that will continue. And we've seen private equity companies. I'm involved with TPG's Rise Climate Fund, which is the largest non-infrastructure fund. And we see great opportunities continuing to rise in, for lack of a better word of calling them, climate solutions. So there's a whole entrepreneurial field that's now growing around whether it's natural foods or, the EV world and those kinds of things. Nature is well behind on that. And in large part because it's much more difficult to try and determine how do you put a value on a coral reef or a coastal wetland or pollinators, the birds and bees. But if we can start to get that right, and there's a movement towards doing that, that too could open up a whole other field. And the good thing is money doesn't tend to be political or fungible or even, or political or have necessarily a heart. It goes to where the returns are. And so if we can start to create the right infrastructure, we can attract for nature, we can attract the capital.
How do you do that? How do you how do you attempt to do it?
Well, a large part has to be government. I mean, in this sense, you've got to get government involved to create some of the regulatory structure. And I'm not talking necessarily mandatory disclosures or things like that, but to create the right infrastructure and seeing there's an opportunity there. At the Paulson Institute, through the study that we did, we found that about 50% of the financing gap between what needs to go into protecting nature and what's going into it now could be addressed just through diverting subsidies into the right causes, as opposed to subsidies going into things that harm nature. And just to give you an example, it's as simple as planting the right crops in the wrong place. So if you can be planting crops that are supportive of biodiversity in the right place, it's going to be good for the whole ecosystem versus, say, plants that tend to destroy the soil over time or require larger areas of plowing pristine grasslands to grow because they are politically correct or because those subsidies have been there for a long time and nobody has the political wherewithal to change them, those kinds of things.
Yeah, it reminds me of this story or event. I was doing environmental engineering in Australia,
Mhm.
and we did a case study where they showed the government was subsidizing rice cultivation in northeast Australia, right? Like in Queensland and New South Wales, and it's a very very dry continent, and you're subsidizing the crop that requires the most water intensive agriculture, and they ended up yeah causing a lot of salination issues, and the farmland was destroyed, and etc., right? So perhaps just
Well,
making
thank you,
sure
Jason,
this,
for making the point. That is exactly the
yeah,
right example. And sometimes it's not any nobody's trying to do harm. It's just a question of having better planning.
don't subsidize destruction, I guess.
Yes.
Easier said than done, right? There's always the law of unintended consequences. So, um, uh, kind of the final topic tree, Deborah, that I wanted to shift to
Mhm.
is, I mean, throughout your career, you've been so incredibly close to power, right? Or institutions of power, people of power, right?
I don't know about that.
U.S. presidents, Wall Street, right? Beijing. Now you're probably rubbing shoulders with the crown prince in Saudi Arabia. I'm not sure, but I'm putting words in your mouth. But
No.
um, how do you stay kind of an independent actor when you're surrounded by all this power, right? For simple word, I don't want to say glitz and glamour because that's not what it's about. It's some of the most powerful institutions in the world, and you have spent a lot of time with them, advising them, around them. How do you not get sucked in to the machine, so to speak?
Um, well, I've that is definitely an over generous statement. But I have had the great privilege of working with some incredible people, with Hank Paulson being one of those. And one of the most wonderful things about Secretary Paulson is he's very direct and he's very down to earth. And to learn from someone like that what has been a real privilege. And I have not gone back into government, but have known lots of people who have. And I think learning from those experiences, learning how governments work, understanding what their priorities are, have been something that we've tried to help our clients understand as well, because even though governments may have different priorities, many times they often act in similar ways. and understanding how to work around them, I think is really important when you're trying to achieve certain objectives. And to me, it's often been about how do we come up with a plan to achieve the objectives we want, whether it's for a company or whether it's for a cause like the Antiquities. And it's got to be, and I think Ronald Reagan said this about us, you can do a lot if you don't want the credit. And to me, it's never about trying to get the credit, and it's not about me and my positioning or where I am or what my title is. It's about how we really stay true to pushing for those goals that we care about.
Well, that's an excellent sentence. Thank you for sharing that. You can do a lot if you don't want the credit. Um, Jason, any final topic tree related or unrelated questions for Deborah?
We've covered a lot of topics.
We sure did.
We have, yeah.
Well, maybe, yeah, I would say when I read through your biography, it seems like although you were in many different roles, they always seem to have this theme of building bridges or connecting different groups to get them to better understand each other. Would you say that's a correct observation? And for other people out there that would like to do the same, do you have any words of advice for them?
Great. Well, I had never quite thought about it that way, Jason, but I do think that that definitely rings true. And I've always believed that finding ways to communicate, even if we disagree, is incredibly important, because you have to be talking even to identify your differences if you're going to have any chance of resolving them. And so, how we find ways to do that that are productive and often don't involve megaphone diplomacy. But for individuals who are looking to get involved, to me, the one thing I always am surprised by, which I can't believe at this time in my career, it still surprises me, but it's very rewarding, is individuals really make a difference. And individuals sitting wherever they are can make a huge difference. Whether it's, you know, President Trump at the time that he was sitting there as an individual made a huge difference in resolving what happened in the Middle East. Having individuals like Jen made a big difference in what she saw as a vision for the health passport to make sure that you could travel around to different countries seamlessly during COVID. And so if people have a vision, they should never think that just because they want to engage in something that seems so far and so high above them or so difficult, one individual can change a system. They just have to be smart about how they go about it, even if they don't have a platform like President Trump. I mean, I know he's got a big platform to do that, but others can make a difference. And so it makes a difference who's sitting in the chair when you want to get something done.
Yeah, and I mean, even President Trump wasn't born with a platform, right? He built it just like everybody else who has a megaphone, so to speak, or has a platform, has a following, has people
Mhm.
that listen to them. It just takes time and effort. So the only thing I would add to what you said is you pursue it, you try to be smart about it, and you just don't give up. Just keep pushing, right?
And don't
Be
worry too
consistent.
much
Sometimes
about
it's
the
not a
credit.
direct line.
Yeah.
Sometimes you have to take lots of twists and turns to get there.
Deborah, thank you so much for taking the time. This has been a fantastic hour and couple minutes. We've ranged from so many topics. Really enjoyed your insights across the board. China is a really interesting topic to both Jason and I. So it was fantastic to have your view on a lot of these things. And wish you all the best for your endeavors. They all sound like they attempt to make the world and the people in the world better and the world a better place. So thank you for putting your energy and effort into them.
Great. Well, thank you.
Deborah, just before we go, anything specific you want to put on our audience's radar that you're working on? I mean, everything that we've discussed, will of course put notes to links to those in the show notes. But is there anything specific you might want to bring to our listeners that you're working on?
Maybe just because I'm so fascinated by it. But the nature finance thing, I think, is going to be the whole biodiversity is going to be a next big thing,
Mhm.
particularly as countries start to recognize their strategic assets And it's a little bit of some have to, but others of just like we've seen this revolution in cultural tourism, you know, Dr. Zahi Hawass, the famous archaeologist, talked about the difference it made simply putting a wall around the pyramids, because then once you put a wall, you could control emission, you could charge a ticket for a ticket. And then you could have people who tour guides and you could maintain the quality. And then people needed water, so people came in to sell. And then they wanted to buy mementos, so they built up stores, and it created a whole ecosystem. And you can see how you can have a multiplier effect with some of these simple actions around cultural tourism, the same with what we see of ecotourism, but even more broadly, nature financing. And so that, I think, for innovative people starting to put their minds around solving some of those challenges and the good that nature can do that we often don't even notice because we take for granted so much of it around us.
Okay. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed the conversation. So thanks for making the time for us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on. It's a real honor. Great.
And that wraps up our main conversation. But we're not done yet. We're going into overtime, where Jason and I unpack some insights, reflect on what just happened, and connect a few dots. And go.
Oh, don't know what to say. I
Yeah.
don't. I'm in awe again. I'm glad I dressed up.
Yeah. Slick back the hair, dressed up a little bit. That's definitely a good call. Good call today.
Yeah, man. Oh my! Like if I didn't dress up again, I think my female friends would not forgive me.
No, maybe Jen looks at it and she's like, "Well, you didn't do that for me."
No. Next time when Jen comes on, that tie.
Yeah, Deborah, incredible. I need to learn how to speak more like I'm on the record. I don't mean it. That's not what I mean. She clearly has had training to avoid all the ums and ahs and all that stuff.
Yeah, every word counts.
Every word counts. Yeah. I mean, it is a delicate balance, right? The worlds she navigates. So of course, every word has to be considered somewhat. But I don't mean it in a sense of self-censorship while she talks. I purely meant it in the sense of almost just very proficient.
Yeah, very high signal to noise ratio, right? No waffling about.
No waffling here. Yeah, whenever I edit these episodes, I hear myself speaking. I'm always like, "Oh my god, just get to the point. Ask the question, dumbass."
Well, luckily I don't have to do the editing. If not, I'd be full of acid in the guts and white hairs everywhere. No, but yeah, I mean, I feel again so grateful, right, to have these kinds of guests and to be able to share that time with them and to pick their brains, and they're so graceful with their time, and just to see and learn about how they work and how they function and the mental frameworks they use. Yeah, very inspiring, and it motivates me to grow, I guess, to reach higher and to, yeah, I don't know, do the work so that you get that sort of clarity of mind and clarity of speech and clarity of vision, right? I think that only comes from you showing up and doing the work day in, day out over years, right? And it was the same with Doomberg. It was the same with Rick Rule. It was the same with nearly all our guests, like with Louis, with Luke Roman. They're so clear on what they're trying to do and confident and comfortable in that space, in that role. So yeah, I really enjoy listening to them and picking their brains.
Yeah, I see the small icon on my computer that's National Fossil Day. And I thought it was interesting that it sounded like Deborah's kind of personal interest in this archaeology, where she took a class and led her basically to this forming, falling down the rabbit hole, it sounds like, and founding this Antiquities coalition, which then somehow brought her to Saudi and like got more involved in that area. Like it's incredible how that cascade can happen, right? If you already have a big network and you're a motivated hard worker, but then you add to that a little bit of spice of your personal interests and things can just start happening, and before you know it, you have a almost like a completely new direction that you can go into. And she's really had an incredible career, right? She didn't get stuck in government, if I want to simplify her origin story. She actually really I don't know, transcend, but she really kept evolving. That's really
I think
cool.
she kept chasing her curiosity and her interest in a way, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it reminds me of what Rick Rule said when he was comparing his competitors working to buy a Lamborghini when he was working to make sure his customers were satisfied, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's almost as if what's your motivation plays such a big role in where you end up. It's not really the stated goal or the stated KPI, but more the motivation towards achieving those KPIs, right? And in this case with Deborah, I think her motivations were always something higher than just what was probably written on her quarterly or yearly, mandate or report, right?
Yeah, undoubtedly. Otherwise, otherwise, I think a person doesn't go and achieve as much.
I do regret though that I didn't manage to ask her about Indiana Jones. I'm gonna send her an email afterwards.
Man, that would
Yeah,
have been such a good closing question.
I was gonna slip it in, and then the topics changed. So
Oh, sorry, man. I was trying to be conscious of time and
yeah, next time
really wanted.
I'll wear the Indiana Jones hat and then say, "Hey, I want to ask." Bring props to the. We should always bring props to the interview, just like you did with the cup yesterday.
With a whip. You bring a whip or a hat. Oh, maybe the hat.
I think the hat's good enough. Whip might
Yeah,
give wrong
that's
impressions.
I don't know. It's intimidating. Um, yeah. So she says nature finance might be the next big thing. So we got to study up on that topic. I have a
I'd
feeling that she wouldn't say this lightly.
I'd buy into that way more than the whole ESG thing so far, right? Because I think it's something that I don't know. I guess I hear her point about when you are counting how many tons of CO2, it's easier to measure, right? But I imagine if you had some ESG nature score surrounding dependent on, hey, how many keystone species you manage to double the population of, right? Every extra silverback gorilla in the wild, these people get how many thousands, right? I think maybe it's a bit more sophisticated and complex, but I think the results might be a lot better, rather than counting trees that were already there and saying
One,
that
it's
that's helped my carbon footprint.
one. I think it's quite interesting to think about from an entrepreneurial perspective, right? So she's like, well, just very much like ecotourism or cultural tourism has become a thing.
Mm-hmm.
How can smart entrepreneurs make nature preservation a thing, right? A profitable thing.
Yeah.
Figure out, because that's why I asked, like, well, how do you create ROI in that space? And I mean, yeah, some rules need to be in place. That's true, but ultimately it comes down to the ingenuity of the entrepreneurs, also, right? And then the example with the pyramids, I think, is quite good, right? Because you can turn a cultural heritage site uh, from fr- from almost like a problem, right? If you have unrestricted access, people might litter and steal stuff and whatever, but you can turn it into a whole like not even a business, hundreds of businesses, if you just plan it correctly. So I could totally see something like that also working for nature finance, but you just have to find the right opportunities.
When I was at uni, there was this tragedy of the commons sort of paradox that everyone always had to study and try and understand, right? If something was nobody's property, then everybody would abuse it.
Hmm.
So when she mentioned that pyramid thing and somebody put a fence around it, in a way, what that did was take away that tragedy of the commons because suddenly that spot was now somebody's responsibility. It might still be the state and not private, but it's closer towards having an accountable owner than before, right? And you could imagine if you actually started that and ran that as a corporate entity with maybe the shareholders being the people living in that area, that would work as well, right? It just, you know, people would try to maximize profits while um making sure that that entity is protected because that's their golden goose and they don't want to kill it. So it was just interesting for me when she said that because straight away I thought of the tragedy of the commons and how that is actually going around it.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's a bit counterintuitive almost, right? But it's you have to give somebody kind of the burden of stewardship, but then they also get to reap the benefits as long as they do a good job with it, right?
Yep.
So it's
It-
great. Why not? Why not do that?
like the Ostergaard say, right? It's all about property rights. So, when something is nobody's property, it gets abused. If it's somebody's property, they'll take care of it. And
Yeah.
imagine if somebody owned the oceans, or a group of people, or a group of millions of people owned the oceans, right? And they were managing square footage of that ocean floor. Like you wouldn't have as much overfishing, I would assume, right? Because people would want to make sure this piece of capital, let's say, or asset continues to be an asset. But the moment you overfish and it no longer reproduces the same stocks, then you no longer have an asset. You might even have a liability. So then everybody's super incentivized to make sure things are taken care of, right? Pollution doesn't come in. They will self organize to make sure that rubbish doesn't get dumped in the seas, etc., etc. But right now, it's like a free for alls.
Yeah, shipping routes might get managed better or differently or something. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Really interesting thought. Jace, this is we had 4 incredible guests in rapid succession, and in the meantime we've lined up one more next week. I can't believe it's been just a bit over a year that we've been doing this, and the level of guests we've had the privilege to speak to has like escalated beyond my wildest dreams. So yeah, thank you, man, for starting the project with me and for having these phenomenal conversations.
Thank you, Lovis. Yeah, couldn't have said it better myself. I'm gonna pinch myself later, and when I see it on Apple Podcasts, I'll know. Oh my God, it's real. So yeah, thank you, and let's see. I hope for we'll ask our guests and anyone in the audience if you know somebody interested and interesting. We'd love to talk to them. So let's see who else we can bring on to have these mind expanding conversations.
Exactly.